Sometimes the loneliest among us find hope in the most unexpected places. After losing her husband, schoolteacher Eloise Carter thought her days of surprise and joy were behind her. At 60, she lived quietly in Sparrow's Bend, greeting each empty evening with resigned acceptance. One afternoon at the county fair, she spotted a beaten-up wooden cowboy for $5. Something about his crooked smile made her laugh, so she bought him for her front porch. That night, two drunk troublemakers rode up to her house, but fled when they saw the tall figure in the shadows. The wooden cowboy had scared them off, but what happened next would change Eloise's life forever. How could a simple piece of carved wood give a lonely widow more than just protection? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sparrow's Bend, illuminating a town that time seemed determined to forget. Main Street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that bore the scars of decades under the relentless Texas sun. The old pharmacy had boarded windows, its faded sign still promising prescriptions filled with care. Next door, Henderson's general store remained open, though the shelves grew sparser each year as folks drove the 40 miles to the big box stores in Abilene. Eloise Carter stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, and nodded good morning to her newest companion. The wooden cowboy stood sentinel beside her rocking chair, his paint-chipped face turned toward the rising sun. In daylight, he looked even more weathered than she remembered from the fair. His blue shirt had faded to gray. One boot showed bare wood where the brown paint had worn away, and his hat sat at a rakish angle that made him appear perpetually amused by some private joke. "Well, partner," she said softly, settling into her chair, "what do you suppose this day will bring?" The wooden figure offered no response, but somehow his presence made the morning feel less solitary. 3 years had passed since Thomas died, and Eloise had grown accustomed to the silence that filled her days. The other teachers at the county schools had tried to include her in their social gatherings at first, but Sparrow's Bend sat too far from their suburban lives for convenience. Eventually the invitations stopped coming, and Eloise told herself she preferred the quiet. She sipped her coffee and watched as Mrs. Patterson emerged from the house across the street, shaking out a rug with the vigor of a woman half her age. At 78, Bertha Patterson remained the unofficial mayor of their dwindling neighborhood, keeping watch over everyone's business with the dedication of a frontier scout. "Morning, Eloise," Bertha called, her voice carrying easily across the narrow street. "I see you've got yourself some company there." "Morning, Bertha. Meet my new friend. I haven't settled on a name for him yet." Bertha squinted at the wooden figure, hands planted firmly on her hips. "Looks like a Frank to me. Got that weathered, seen-it-all expression. My late husband Frank had the same look after 30 years of marriage." Eloise smiled, the first genuine expression of amusement she'd felt in weeks. "Frank it is, then." The school bell's distant chime reminded her that another day of teaching awaited. She finished her coffee, gave Frank a pat on his wooden shoulder, and headed inside to gather her materials. The small schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town, a one-story brick building that had served Sparrow's Bend's children since 1885. Its original bell tower still stood proud against the sky, though the brass bell inside had developed a crack that gave its daily calls a slightly mournful tone. Inside her kitchen, Eloise opened the weathered tin box that had belonged to her mother. Martha's recipe cards, yellowed with age and spotted with decades of cooking, represented more than mere instructions for meals. Each card told a story: the Sunday pot roast that brought the family together, the sugar cookies that made Christmas magical, the cornbread that stretched lean meals into satisfying ones. Eloise selected a card for evening's dinner, already knowing she would cook for one again. The routine of preparation soothed her, gathering lesson plans, checking that her reading glasses hung from their familiar chain, ensuring her chalk box held enough pieces for the day's mathematics lessons. At 60, she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had performed these same motions for nearly 4 decades. Teaching had become as natural as breathing, though some days she wondered if her breath was growing shallow. Sparrows Bend Elementary housed only 14 students this year, down from 18 the previous fall. The Mendoza family had moved to Abilene over the summer, taking their 3 children with them in search of better opportunities. The Martinez family spoke openly about following suit, worried that young Tommy wasn't getting the education he deserved in such a small school. As Eloise walked the 6 blocks to school, she passed the empty lot where the Sinclair gas station once stood. The pumps had been removed years ago, leaving only concrete patches and weeds. Beyond that, the old Methodist church still held services, though Pastor Williams drove in from 2 towns over, and the congregation had dwindled to fewer than a dozen faithful souls. The schoolhouse appeared around the bend, its red brick facade stubborn in its refusal to acknowledge decay. Someone, probably Joe Henley, the town's part-time handyman and full-time doctor, had recently repaired the front steps and given the door a fresh coat of green paint. Small kindnesses like these kept the building functioning, though everyone understood that kindness alone couldn't solve the deeper problems. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Tommy Martinez called out as she approached. At 10 years old, he possessed the quick intelligence and eager curiosity that made teaching a joy rather than a chore. His younger sister, Maria, 8, stood beside him with a gap-toothed grin and a book clutched against her chest. "Good morning, you two. Maria, what are you reading today?" "Charlotte's Web," the girl announced proudly. "I'm on chapter 6. "Excellent choice. We'll discuss it during reading time." Inside the schoolhouse, 14 desks arranged in 3 neat rows faced the blackboard where Eloise had written the day's schedule in her careful cursive. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The building smelled of chalk, old books, and the faint scent of the wildflowers that bloomed just outside the eastern windows. Her students filed in with the easy familiarity of children who had known each other since birth. The oldest, 16-year-old, Sarah Henderson, helped the youngest ones hang their jackets and settle into their seats. This mixing of ages had once been common in rural schools, but now it marked Sparrows Bend as an anachronism in an era of age-segregated classrooms and specialized curricula. "Today we'll begin with mathematics," Eloise announced, turning to write problems on the blackboard. "Tommy, can you tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" The boy's face scrunched in concentration. 56? "Correct. Sarah, help the younger ones with their addition while I work with the older students on multiplication tables." This dance of differentiated instruction had become second nature over the years. While other teachers struggled with classrooms of 30 identical-age students, Eloise orchestrated learning across multiple grade levels with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony. The older children helped the younger ones, creating bonds that extended far beyond the classroom walls. During lunch, eaten at their desks from brown paper bags and metal lunchboxes, Eloise listened to her students chatter about their families' lives. The Hendersons' general store had received a shipment of new candy, which caused great excitement among the younger children. The Patterson twins' grandfather was visiting from Oklahoma, bringing stories of oil wells and city life. Tommy Martinez had found an injured bird and nursed it back to health, demonstrating the gentle nature that made him special. "Miss Carter," Sarah Henderson said, as the other children played outside during recess, "my mama says there might not be a school here much longer. Is that true?" The question struck Eloise like a physical blow, though she kept her expression calm. "Why would your mother think that, dear?" She heard talk at the store, people saying there aren't enough kids, and it costs too much money to keep the school open just for us. Eloise chose her words carefully. "Sometimes adults worry about things that may never happen. What matters is that you're here now, learning and growing. That's what we focus on." But Sarah's question lingered in Eloise's mind as the afternoon progressed. During the final hour, she read aloud from Island of the Blue Dolphins, watching her students' faces as they lost themselves in Karana's survival story. These moments when literature transported young minds beyond the boundaries of their small town reminded her why teaching mattered. The final bell rang at 3:15, and her students gathered their belongings with the unhurried pace of children who had nowhere urgent to be. Some would help with farm chores, others would play in backyards under their mother's watchful eyes. None would rush to soccer practice or piano lessons or the dozen activities that filled suburban children's afternoons. Alone in the classroom, Eloise began erasing the blackboard, each stroke removing the day's lessons, but not the satisfaction they had brought. She straightened desks, collected forgotten pencils, and watered the small garden of plants that lined the windowsills. These tasks, performed in the golden light of late afternoon, carried a meditative quality that helped her process the day's events. The walk home took her past Doc Henley's office, where the elderly physician waved from his window, past Sheriff Wade's house, where the part-time lawman tended his vegetable garden, past the cemetery where Thomas rested beneath a simple granite headstone that read, "Beloved husband and teacher." She paused at his grave, as she did most evenings, and updated him on the day's events. "The children are learning well," she said softly. "Tommy Martinez solved a division problem that stumped him last week. Sarah Henderson is reading at a high school level." She hesitated, then added, "There's talk about closing the school. I don't know what I'll do if that happens." The evening breeze rustled through the mesquite trees, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Eloise touched the headstone gently, then continued toward home, where Frank waited on the porch. "How was your day, partner?" she asked, settling into her rocking chair beside him. The wooden cowboy's painted eyes seemed to regard her with patient understanding. "Mine was challenging. Some days I wonder if I'm fighting a losing battle, trying to keep something alive that the world has decided to let die." She opened her mother's recipe box and selected a card for chicken and dumplings comfort food for a troubled heart. In the kitchen, she moved through the familiar motions of cooking, talking to Frank through the open window as she worked. "You know what I appreciate about you," she called out. "You don't offer unwanted advice or tell me everything happens for a reason. You just listen." As twilight settled over Sparrow's Bend, Eloise carried her dinner to the porch and ate while watching the first stars appear. Frank stood silently beside her, a guardian against the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 long years. "Thank you for last night," she said quietly. "I don't know if those men meant real harm, but having you here made me feel safer than I have in a long time." A car drove slowly down Main Street, its headlights sweeping across the empty storefronts. Soon, the driver would reach the highway and disappear into the larger world, beyond Sparrow's Bend. But Eloise remained, along with Frank and the handful of other souls who called this fading place home. "Tomorrow's another day," she told her wooden companion. "We'll see what it brings." The stars brightened overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. Eloise Carter, no longer quite as alone as she had been the day before, rocked gently in her chair and listened to the peaceful sounds of her small town settling into sleep. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by Sheriff Wade, with an expression that told Eloise everything she needed to know before she opened it. The official letterhead of the Sparrows Bend School Board seemed to mock her as she unfolded the crisp white paper with trembling fingers. "Notice of emergency board meeting," the header proclaimed in bold letters. Below, in language careful and clinical, the document outlined the purpose: to discuss the future viability of Sparrows Bend Elementary School in light of declining enrollment and budgetary constraints. Sheriff Wade shifted uncomfortably on her porch steps, his weathered hands turning his hat in slow circles. "I'm sorry, Eloise. They asked me to deliver it personally rather than mail it. Show of respect," they said. "When?" she asked, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock at the community center." Eloise nodded, unable to trust herself to speak. After Wade left, she sank into her rocking chair beside Frank, the letter fluttering in her shaking hands like a wounded bird. 14 children, she whispered to her wooden companion. 14 bright, eager minds, and they want to scatter them to the winds because it's not cost-effective. The rest of Tuesday passed in a haze of mechanical motions. She taught her lessons, helped with mathematics problems, read aloud from their current novel. But underneath the familiar routine, panic clawed at her chest. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her identity, her purpose, the thing that gave shape to her days and meaning to her existence. Wednesday brought a parade of concerned parents to her classroom door. Mary Martinez arrived first, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded with worry. Is it true what they're saying about closing the school? Eloise chose her words carefully, aware that every syllable would be repeated throughout the community before sunset. There's going to be a meeting Thursday night. The board wants to discuss the school's future. But where would Tommy and Maria go? The nearest school is 40 miles away. I don't drive, and Miguel can't take them every day. He's got to be at the ranch before dawn. The reality struck Eloise like a physical blow. She had been thinking about her own loss, her own displacement. But for families like the Martinez clan, closing the school meant impossible choices between education and survival. We don't know anything for certain yet, Eloise said gently. Let's wait and see what Thursday brings. But as the day progressed, more parents appeared with the same worried questions. The Henderson family, whose general store anchored what remained of the town's economy. The Patterson twins' mother, who worked 2 jobs to support her children. Families who had roots in Sparrow's Bend, stretching back generations, now facing the possibility of losing the institution that had educated their grandparents and great-grandparents. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable coolness, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood settling over the community. Eloise dressed carefully in her best navy dress and her mother's pearl necklace. Armor for a battle she wasn't sure she could win. "Wish me luck," she told Frank before leaving. The wooden cowboy's painted expression seemed more serious than usual in the porch light's glow. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in for the meeting. Eloise recognized almost every face. This was her extended family, the people she had taught, their children, and their children's children. The 5 school board members sat at a folding table at the front of the room, their faces carefully neutral. Board Chairman Robert Sterling called the meeting to order with the efficiency of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. His expensive suit and polished shoes seemed out of place in the humble community center, reminders that he lived in Abilene and viewed Sparrow's Bend through the lens of spreadsheets and budget reports. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. We're here to discuss the fiscal reality facing Sparrow's Bend Elementary School. He shuffled through papers with practiced precision. Current enrollment stands at 14 students. State funding allocation for schools our size has decreased by 30% over the past 5 years. Maintaining the facility, utilities, and teacher salary represents a per-pupil cost that exceeds state averages by nearly 200%. Numbers. Cold, clinical numbers that reduced living, breathing children to line items on a budget. What we're proposing, Sterling continued, is the consolidation of Sparrow's Bend Elementary with the Abilene School District. Students would be transported daily via bus service, ensuring they receive education that meets modern standards and offers opportunities that a single-teacher school simply cannot provide. The room erupted in voices. Parents shouted questions about transportation times and class sizes. Elderly residents spoke passionately about tradition and community identity. Through it all, Eloise sat silently, processing the magnitude of what was being proposed. "Miss Carter," Sterling's voice cut through the chaos, "as the school's teacher, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts." All eyes turned to her, and for a moment, Eloise felt the weight of 60 years pressing down on her shoulders. These people trusted her, had entrusted their children to her care. They deserved more than resignation. She stood slowly, drawing strength from some reservoir she hadn't known existed. "Mr. Sterling, you speak of numbers and efficiency, but you haven't mentioned what those numbers represent." Tommy Martinez, who struggles with reading but excels at mathematics when given individual attention. Sarah Henderson, who's reading at a college level and helps younger students with their lessons. Maria Martinez, who's discovered a love of science because she has the freedom to explore subjects at her own pace. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "You talk about modern standards, but what standard measures kindness? What metric captures the moment when a struggling child finally understands a difficult concept? How do you quantify the value of a school where every child is known, valued, and nurtured as an individual?" "That's very touching, Miss Carter," Sterling replied with barely concealed condescension. "But emotion doesn't balance budgets. These children deserve science laboratories, computer classes, art programs, and music instruction. They deserve preparation for a competitive world. They deserve to be valued as more than statistics," Eloise shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. "They deserve to learn in a place where they're not lost in overcrowded classrooms, where their teacher knows their names and their dreams and their fears." The debate continued for another hour, with passionate arguments on both sides. Some parents worried about their children falling behind academically. Others feared losing the heart of their community. Board members cited state regulations and funding formulas, while residents spoke of heritage and identity. When the meeting finally ended, no formal decision had been made, but the writing was on the wall. The board would vote at their next regular meeting in 2 weeks. Unless enrollment increased dramatically or some miracle funding materialized, Sparrows Bend Elementary would close its doors forever. Eloise walked home through empty streets, her footsteps echoing off pavement that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The fight had awakened something in her: anger, perhaps, or determination. She wasn't sure which, but the passive acceptance that had characterized her last 3 years was gone. Frank waited on the porch, steadfast in his wooden vigil. Eloise sank into her rocking chair and allowed the tears to come, tears of frustration, loss, and uncertainty about the future. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to her silent companion. "I've taught in that building for 37 years. Thomas and I dreamed of the children we'd never have, but I got to teach hundreds of other people's children instead. Now, they want to take that away too." Inside the house, she opened her jewelry box and removed Thomas's wedding ring from its velvet compartment. She hadn't looked at it since the funeral, couldn't bear the weight of memory it carried. Now, holding the simple gold band in her palm, she remembered their wedding day, young, hopeful, believing the world held infinite possibilities. "We were going to change everything," she said to the empty room. "Make a difference in children's lives, build something lasting and meaningful." The ring caught the lamplight, throwing tiny sparkles across the ceiling like scattered stars. Thomas had believed in education's power to transform lives, had spent his own career teaching high school mathematics with passion and dedication. What would he do in her situation? The answer came to her with startling clarity. He would fight. Not with anger or desperation, but with the quiet determination that had characterized his approach to every challenge they had faced together. Eloise closed her fingers around the ring and made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't let Sparrows Bend Elementary die without a fight. Not for the numbers on Sterling's spreadsheets, and not for the children who deserved better than being treated as budget line items. "All right, Frank," she said, stepping back onto the porch where her wooden guardian waited. "We're going to save our school. I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way." The night wind rustled through the mesquite trees, carrying the promise of rain and the whisper of possibilities yet to be born. Friday morning found Eloise standing before her bathroom mirror, studying the face that Thomas had once called beautiful. 60 years had etched lines around her green eyes and silvered her auburn hair, but something new had appeared overnight, a spark of determination that made her stand straighter, hold her chin higher. "Today we begin," she told Frank as she stepped onto the porch with her morning coffee. "I don't know exactly what we're beginning, but we begin." Her first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house across the street. Bertha answered the door in her housecoat, hair in pink curlers, clearly not expecting visitors at 7 in the morning. "Eloise Carter, what on earth?" "Bertha, I need your help," Eloise interrupted, then immediately softened her tone. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but I've been awake all night, thinking about Thursday's meeting. We can't let them close our school." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from annoyance to interest. "Come in, child. Let me put on some coffee." In Bertha's cluttered kitchen, surrounded by photographs spanning 7 decades of life in Sparrow's Bend, Eloise outlined her plan, or what little of it she had formulated during her sleepless night. "I want to organize community support, show the board that we're serious about keeping the school open. But I need to understand the real history of this place, the reasons it matters beyond sentiment." Bertha settled into her chair with a satisfied grunt. "Well, you've come to the right person. I've lived in this town longer than anyone except old Pete Morrison, and he's 93 and deaf as a post." For the next hour, Bertha regaled Eloise with stories she had heard dozens of times but never truly absorbed. How Sparrow's Bend had been founded in 1882 by cattle ranchers who wanted their children educated. How the original schoolhouse had been built with donated labor and materials, every family contributing what they could. How the town had weathered the Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic downturns largely because educated children had grown up to become leaders, innovators, and community builders. "Your own daddy was one of the first official teachers here," Bertha said, reaching for a photo album. "Look at this." She pulled out a faded photograph showing a group of serious-faced men in suits standing before the school building. In the center, looking impossibly young, stood Eloise's father, holding a rolled document. "That's his teaching certificate," Bertha explained. 1923. He was just 22 years old, fresh out of college, but he stayed here for 43 years, taught 3 generations of the same families. Eloise stared at the photograph, seeing her father not as the grey-haired man of her childhood memories, but as a young idealist who had chosen to build his life in this small town. The teaching certificate in his hand looked remarkably similar to her own, framed and hanging in her bedroom, a connection across decades that suddenly felt profound. "I never knew he was the first official teacher." "Honey, your family has been educating children in this town longer than anyone. Your daddy, then you. It's in your blood, this calling to teach." Armed with new purpose and Bertha's promise to help spread the word, Eloise spent the weekend visiting long-time residents. She knocked on doors, sat in living rooms filled with memorabilia, and listened to stories that painted a picture of education as the cornerstone of community identity. At Doc Henley's office, she found the elderly physician organizing medical supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had been treating the same families for decades. "Eloise, good to see you. How are you holding up after Thursday's meeting?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Joe. I'm trying to build support for keeping the school open, and I know you've seen how important education is to this community's health." Doc Henley paused in his sorting, his weathered hands resting on a box of bandages. "You know, in 40 years of practice, I've watched 3 generations grow up in this town. The ones who got good educations early, who learned to think and question and solve problems, they're the ones who built successful lives, whether they stayed here or moved on. The school isn't just about reading and arithmetic. It's about teaching children that learning matters, that they matter. Would you be willing to speak at the next board meeting, share that perspective?" "Absolutely, and I'll do more than that." He reached for his prescription pad and began writing. "I'm going to write a letter to every parent in town, explaining how education affects children's development. Sometimes people need to hear from someone they trust that this isn't just about preserving the past, it's about giving children the best possible future." By Sunday evening, Eloise had visited 18 households and spoken with nearly every adult in Sparrow's Bend. The responses varied, some enthusiastic, others skeptical, a few openly hostile to what they saw as resistance to progress. But gradually, a picture emerged of a community divided not by malice, but by genuine disagreement about what was best for their children. The Henderson family, who ran the general store, worried that their daughter Sarah wasn't being challenged academically. "She's reading high school books already," Mary Henderson explained. "What happens when she outgrows what Miss Carter can teach her?" The concern stung, but Eloise recognized its validity. "You're right that I can't offer advanced chemistry or calculus, but I can help Sarah develop critical thinking skills, teach her to research and write and question. When she does move on to high school, she'll be better prepared than students who've been passive recipients of information." Others shared different concerns. The Martinez family faced practical challenges. If the school closed, how would Miguel get Tommy and Maria to Abilene every day while maintaining his job at the cattle ranch? The Patterson twins' mother, Linda, worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford gas for daily trips to town. "They keep talking about bus service," Linda said during Eloise's visit to her modest trailer home. "But what happens when the bus breaks down? What happens during bad weather? My kids would miss more school than they attend." These conversations revealed the complexity of the issue beyond budgets and enrollment numbers. For some families, the local school represented opportunity and individual attention their children couldn't get elsewhere. For others, it symbolized limitation and isolation from the larger world. Monday morning brought Eloise back to her classroom with renewed energy, but also deeper understanding of the challenges ahead. During lunch, she shared her weekend experiences with Frank through the open window. "I learned something important," she said while unwrapping her sandwich. "This isn't just about saving a building or preserving tradition. It's about different visions of what education should be. Some people believe bigger is automatically better. Others think personal attention and community connection matter more than facilities." That afternoon, young Tommy Martinez approached her desk after the other students had left. "Miss Carter, my papa says we might have to move if the school closes. I don't want to move. All my friends are here." Eloise knelt to his level, looking into brown eyes that reflected wisdom beyond his 10 years. "Tommy, sometimes changes happen that we can't control, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're smart and capable and ready to learn wherever you go. But I like learning here. You explain things, so I understand them. At the big school, will they know that I'm better at math than reading?" The question crystallized everything Eloise was fighting for. In a classroom of 14, she knew each child's strengths, struggles, and learning style. She could adapt her teaching to meet individual needs, provide encouragement where needed, and challenge students when they were ready to grow. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep our school open," she promised him. "But whatever happens, remember that learning isn't about the building. It's about your mind and your curiosity and your willingness to grow." That evening, sitting on her porch beside Frank, as stars emerged in the darkening sky, Eloise reflected on the magnitude of what she had undertaken. Saving the school would require more than good intentions and community nostalgia. It would demand strategic thinking, persuasive arguments, and probably some miracle she couldn't yet imagine. "The hardest part," she told her wooden companion, "is that some of their concerns are valid. We don't have science labs or computer rooms or music programs. How do I argue that what we offer is better when I'm not sure it always is?" Frank maintained his silent vigil, his painted face serene in the porch light. Sometimes, Eloise had learned, the most helpful response was simply bearing witness to someone's struggles without trying to fix them. Tuesday brought an unexpected discovery that changed everything. While searching through her desk for parent contact information, Eloise's fingers brushed against something wedged behind the bottom drawer. With some effort, she extracted a dusty shoebox that had apparently fallen years ago and been forgotten. The box bore her mother's careful handwriting, letters from students. Save, always. Inside, Eloise found dozens of thank you notes, Christmas cards, and letters that spanned her 37-year career. With trembling hands, she lifted the first envelope, postmarked 15 years earlier. Dear Miss Carter, the letter began in careful cursive. I wanted you to know that I graduated from medical school last month. Every time I had to study something difficult, I remembered how patient you were when I couldn't understand fractions. You never made me feel stupid, even when I was the only one who didn't get it. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Dr. Amanda Flores, formerly Amanda Sanchez. Eloise sank into her desk chair, overcome by emotion. She remembered Amanda, a shy girl who had struggled with mathematics but showed remarkable empathy when classmates were hurt or upset. To learn that she had become a doctor felt like witnessing a miracle unfold across time. The next letter came from David Henderson, Sarah's older brother, now working as an engineer in Houston. You taught me that asking questions isn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of intelligence. That lesson helped me succeed in college and in my career. Thank you for encouraging my curiosity instead of telling me to be quiet and listen. Letter after letter revealed similar stories. Students who had gone on to become teachers, nurses, business owners, artists, and parents, all crediting their foundation in Sparrows Bend Elementary with giving them confidence, critical thinking skills, and most importantly, the belief that they mattered as individuals. One letter stopped her cold. It was from James Patterson, Bertha's grandson, written 5 years earlier from Afghanistan. Miss Carter, I'm writing this from a place where education is a privilege many children will never have. It makes me appreciate what you gave all of us, not just reading and writing, but the understanding that learning is a gift. You taught us to think for ourselves, to question what doesn't make sense, and to treat everyone with respect regardless of their background. Those lessons are keeping me alive over here and helping me be a better soldier and a better man. By the time she finished reading, Eloise's desk was covered with letters and her cheeks were wet with tears. These weren't just polite thank you notes, they were testimonials to the power of personalized education, evidence that what happened in small-town classrooms could change lives in profound ways. Frank, she said during lunch, carrying the shoebox to her usual spot by the window, I've been thinking about this all wrong. I've been trying to defend what we have instead of celebrating what we've accomplished. That afternoon, she made a decision that would reshape her entire approach. Instead of focusing on the school board, she would reach out to her former students, the living proof of Sparrows Bend Elementary's value. She spent the evening crafting letters to every former student whose address she could find. The message was simple but heartfelt. Dear friend, I hope this letter finds you well and thriving. As you may have heard, our little school faces the possibility of closure due to declining enrollment and budget concerns. Before any final decisions are made, I wanted to reach out to you and others who learned within these walls. If our school made a positive difference in your life, would you consider sharing your story? Your voice might help current and future students have the same opportunities for growth that you experienced here. With gratitude for the privilege of being your teacher, Miss Eloise Carter. She addressed envelopes until her hand cramped, working by lamplight, while Frank stood sentinel on the porch. 43 letters in total, sent to former students scattered across Texas and beyond. Each envelope contained not just her request, but copies of some of the letters she had discovered, hoping to remind recipients of the connections they had formed in this small-town classroom. Wednesday brought the first response, a phone call that interrupted her morning coffee. Miss Carter, this is Dr. Amanda Flores. I got your letter yesterday, and I wanted to call immediately. Eloise nearly dropped her mug in surprise. Amanda, I can't believe, I just found your letter from medical school graduation. That letter was 15 years overdue. I should have written sooner to tell you how much you influenced my life. When I heard about the school closing, I knew I had to do something. They talked for 30 minutes, Amanda sharing stories of her pediatric practice in Austin and how the individual attention she had received in Sparrows Bend had shaped her approach to treating young patients. "I want to help," Amanda said before hanging up. "I'll write a letter to the school board, but I'll do more than that. I'll drive down for the next meeting and speak in person." Other former students should hear about this too. "Do you have contact information for the Henderson boys, for Maria Santos? We need to organize." Thursday brought 3 more calls and 2 emails from former students. By Friday, Eloise had heard from 12 people, each offering to help in whatever way possible. Some lived too far away to attend meetings, but promised written testimonials. Others, like Amanda, committed to making the drive to Sparrows Bend for the decisive school board meeting. The weekend brought an unexpected visitor. David Henderson knocked on her door Saturday morning, his expensive suit and confident bearing marking him as someone who had found success in the larger world. "Miss Carter, I came as soon as I got your letter. My parents told me what's happening with the school." They sat on her porch, David in the chair usually reserved for her morning coffee, while Frank maintained his wooden vigil nearby. "You know what I remember most about your classroom?" David asked. "You never talked down to us. You treated us like our thoughts and questions mattered. When I went to high school, then college, I was shocked by how many teachers seemed to think their job was to fill us with information rather than teach us to think. You always were a questioner." Eloise smiled. "Your poor parents, you wore them out with why and how come. That curiosity you encouraged led me to engineering. But more than that, it taught me to look for solutions instead of just accepting problems." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about this situation, and I have some ideas. What if we could show the board that Sparrows Bend Elementary produces results that rival or exceed larger schools? What if we could demonstrate that personalized education isn't just nostalgic sentiment, but proven methodology?" David spent the next hour outlining his research into educational outcomes, standardized test scores, and college readiness metrics. His proposal was ambitious: create a comprehensive presentation that would frame the school closure debate in terms of educational excellence rather than budget constraints. "I'll help you gather the data," he promised, "and I'll coordinate with other alumni to make sure we have a strong presence at the next board meeting. This isn't just about saving a building, it's about preserving an approach to education that the world desperately needs." As Sunday evening settled over Sparrows Bend, Eloise reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in just 1 week. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save her job had evolved into something much larger, a movement to demonstrate the value of education that sees children as individuals rather than statistics. "We're not fighting against progress," she told Frank as stars emerged overhead. "We're fighting for a different kind of progress, one that measures success in lives changed rather than budgets balanced." The wooden cowboy stood silent in the gathering darkness, but Eloise felt his presence as a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected allies appear when they're needed most. Just as Frank had provided protection and companionship when she felt most alone, her former students were rallying to protect the place that had shaped their young minds and hearts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since receiving that fateful letter, Eloise Carter felt hope blooming in her chest, like spring flowers pushing through winter soil. Monday morning brought the first tangible response to Eloise's letters, an envelope postmarked from Dallas with unfamiliar return address. Inside, she found a handwritten note that made her sit down hard in her kitchen chair. "Dear Miss Carter, you probably don't remember me. I was Maria Santos, graduated in 1995. Your letter reached me through my mother, who still lives in Abilene. I wanted you to know that everything good in my life started in your classroom. I'm now a children's librarian, and every day I try to give kids the same love of reading you gave me. I'm driving down for the board meeting, and I'm bringing documentation of our school's impact that might surprise you. Stay strong. Maria Santos Williams." The phone rang as Eloise finished reading, startling her from her thoughts. "Miss Carter, this is Robert Sterling, school board chairman. I hope you don't mind the early call." Eloise's grip tightened on the receiver. "Of course not, Mr. Sterling. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to discuss a proposition with you privately before our next board meeting. The Abilene School District has expressed interest in offering you a position 5th grade, excellent benefits, considerably higher salary than what the county can provide. It would be a smooth transition for you and, honestly, a much better opportunity." The words hit Eloise like cold water. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling, but before you decline, hear me out. You're a dedicated teacher, and we respect that. But Sparrows Bend Elementary simply isn't sustainable. Even if we keep it open another year, we're looking at the same situation next year or the year after. Wouldn't it be better to make a planned transition rather than wait for inevitable closure?" Eloise stared out her kitchen window at Frank, whose painted face seemed to regard her with patient understanding. The offer was tempting: financial security, modern facilities, colleagues to collaborate with, instead of the isolation of single-teacher instruction. "Mr. Sterling, I understand your perspective, but I'm not ready to abandon our school. We're building community support, and I believe we can demonstrate its value to the board." A long pause followed. "Miss Carter, I admire your dedication, but please be realistic. We have responsibilities to the taxpayers, state regulations to follow, budgets to balance. Sentiment alone can't keep a school operating." After Sterling hung up, Eloise sat in her quiet kitchen, wrestling with doubt that crept in like morning fog. Was she being selfish, clinging to the past while denying children better opportunities? The questions that had seemed settled just days before now churned in her mind with renewed force. The uncertainty followed her to school, where she struggled to maintain her usual enthusiasm during lessons. At lunch, she confided her doubts to Frank through the open window. "Maybe Sterling is right. Maybe I'm fighting a losing battle, trying to preserve something that's outlived its usefulness." But that afternoon brought an unexpected gift that reaffirmed her purpose. Young Tommy Martinez approached her desk with unusual seriousness. "Miss Carter, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Tommy. What's on your mind?" "My cousin Carlos goes to the big school in Abilene. He says there are 30 kids in his class, and the teacher doesn't have time to help anybody who doesn't understand right away. He's failing math because nobody explained it the way you explain things to me." Tommy's words struck Eloise with startling clarity. "What do you mean, the way I explain things? You know, when I don't get something, you think of different ways to show me until it makes sense. Like when you used candy to teach fractions, or when you let me stand up and walk around while doing multiplication tables because sitting still was too hard." These small adaptations had become second nature to Eloise over the years, recognizing that different children learned in different ways, adjusting her approach based on individual needs rather than rigid curriculum demands. In a larger classroom, such personalization would be impossible. "Tommy, would you be willing to talk about that at the school board meeting, about how learning works better for you here?" The boy considered this seriously. "Would it help save our school?" "It might help people understand what we do here. That's special." "Then yes, I'll talk to them." Tuesday brought Maria Santos Williams to Sparrows Bend, carrying a portfolio that would change how Eloise viewed her own impact. Maria had grown into a confident woman whose passion for education radiated from every gesture and word. "Miss Carter, I've spent the last 5 years documenting something remarkable," Maria explained, as they sat in Eloise's classroom after school hours. "I started tracking down our former classmates, comparing their academic and career outcomes to state and national averages." She opened a thick folder filled with charts, graphs, and statistics. "Look at this, students from Sparrows Bend Elementary show college completion rates 30% higher than the state average. They're more likely to pursue graduate education, more likely to start their own businesses, more likely to return to their communities as leaders and volunteers." Eloise studied the data with growing amazement. But how is that possible? We don't have advanced programs or special resources. That's exactly the point. What we had was individual attention, critical thinking instruction, and the confidence that comes from being truly known by our teachers. You didn't just teach us subjects, you taught us how to learn, how to question, how to persist when things got difficult. Maria pulled out a thick stack of surveys she had conducted with former students. Story after story echoed the same themes: self-confidence, adaptability, strong communication skills, and most importantly, a lifelong love of learning that had carried them through challenges and opportunities. "There's something else," Maria continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I found records of the original school charter from 1885. Miss Carter, this school was built with specific conditions attached to the land donation. If those conditions are still legally binding." "What kind of conditions?" "Educational use in perpetuity. The original donor, a woman named Catherine Morrison, specified that the land could only be used for educating children. If the school closes, legal ownership might revert to her descendants." The revelation sent Eloise's mind racing. Could there be legal protections she hadn't known about? Could the community's fight be supported by more than sentiment and statistics? Wednesday evening brought the most challenging confrontation yet. Sarah Henderson's parents requested a private meeting, and their concerns proved more complex than Eloise had anticipated. "Miss Carter," Mary Henderson began carefully, "we respect everything you've done for Sarah, but we're worried about her future. She's academically gifted reading at a college level, doing mathematics beyond what any single teacher can provide. Are we limiting her potential by keeping her here?" The question cut deep, because Eloise recognized its validity. Sarah was indeed academically advanced, hungry for challenges that Sparrows Bend Elementary couldn't fully provide. "You're right that I can't offer advanced chemistry or calculus," Eloise admitted, "but I can help Sarah develop research skills, critical thinking, and independent learning capabilities that will serve her well, regardless of where she continues her education." "But what about peer interaction with other gifted students? What about advanced placement courses that could give her college credit?" James Henderson, Sarah's father, leaned forward. "We're not trying to hurt the school, but we have to think about what's best for our daughter. The Abilene district has programs specifically for academically gifted students." Eloise spent the next hour discussing Sarah's individual learning plan, the independent study projects she could pursue, and the mentorship opportunities available through correspondence with former students now working in various fields. But underneath the conversation lay a painful truth. Some students might indeed benefit from resources that only larger schools could provide. That night, sitting beside Frank on her porch, Eloise wrestled with the complexity of educational choice. Was she fighting to save the school for the children's benefit, or for her own need to maintain purpose and identity? "The hardest part," she told her wooden companion, "is that there's no simple answer. Some children thrive with individual attention and community connection. Others need the stimulation and resources of larger institutions. How do I fight for what I believe in without dismissing legitimate concerns?" Frank's painted expression seemed thoughtful in the porch light, as if he too understood that the most important battles are rarely between clear right and wrong, but between different versions of what might be best for the people we love. Thursday brought Eloise to the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that had presided over legal matters in the region since 1903. Maria Santos Williams had arranged for them to examine historical records, hoping to find documentation that might support the school's case from an unexpected angle. The basement archive smelled of old paper and forgotten time, its metal shelves stretching into shadows that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of a century's worth of documents. County Clerk Jennifer Walsh, a former student from the late 1980s, unlocked filing cabinets with the reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. Miss Carter, I remember you making us research local history for that project on Texas pioneers, Jennifer said as she pulled out a leather-bound ledger. I never thought I'd be using those research skills to help save the school where I learned them. The original town charter proved fascinating reading. Sparrows Bend had been established not just as a cattle town, but as an intentional community dedicated to education and moral development. The founders, led by cattle baron William Morrison and his daughter Catherine, had specified that education would be the cornerstone of their community's identity. Look at this passage. Maria pointed to faded ink on yellowed paper. The land for the school shall be held in trust for educational purposes in perpetuity, serving the children of Sparrows Bend and surrounding areas so long as said community exists. But more remarkable was Catherine Morrison's personal journal, discovered in a separate archive box. Catherine had been a teacher herself, educated at a women's college in the East before returning to help establish the town. Her entries revealed a woman ahead of her time, passionate about educational philosophy and individual learning. October 15, 1885. Eloise read aloud, began classes today with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Rather than separate them by age as is customary, I have chosen to group them by ability and interest. Young Matthew shows remarkable aptitude for mathematics despite being only 8, while 15-year-old Sarah struggles with basic arithmetic but demonstrates profound understanding of literature and human nature. Each child is a unique constellation of abilities that deserve individual recognition and nurture. The words struck Eloise like lightning. Here, written 140 years ago, was a description of exactly the educational approach she had developed through decades of experience. Catherine Morrison had understood that effective teaching meant seeing children as individuals rather than standardized units. "This is extraordinary," Maria whispered. She was practicing differentiated instruction and multi-age learning decades before modern educational theory caught up. They photographed dozens of pages, building a historical case that Sparrows Bend Elementary represented not outdated tradition, but pioneering educational philosophy that remained relevant today. Catherine Morrison's vision had created something special that deserved preservation rather than abandonment. Friday's mail brought both encouragement and concerning news. Letters from former students continued arriving, but so did a formal notice from the State Education Department requesting detailed enrollment projections and facility assessments. The bureaucratic machinery was moving toward closure, regardless of community sentiment. More troubling was a call from Miguel Martinez during lunch break. "Miss Carter, I need to talk to you about Tommy and Maria. My cousin in Houston says there are good jobs there, construction work that pays 3 times what I make at the ranch. We might have to move before the school question gets decided." The conversation that followed broke Eloise's heart. Miguel wasn't abandoning the fight. Economic necessity was forcing impossible choices. Without the school, he saw little reason to remain in Sparrows Bend. With the school's future uncertain, he couldn't risk his children's education on hope alone. "I understand, Miguel. You have to do what's best for your family." "The kids don't want to leave," Tommy cried when I told him we might move. "But Miss Carter, I can't let them fall behind while we wait to see what happens." That afternoon, Eloise watched Tommy and Maria with new intensity, memorizing the way Tommy's face lit up when he solved a difficult math problem. How Maria bounced in her seat when excited about a story they were reading. These might be among her last weeks with children she had grown to love like her own. The weekend brought the rally that former students had organized, transforming the school grounds into a celebration of educational achievement that took Eloise's breath away. Nearly 50 alumni had returned to Sparrows Bend, some traveling from as far as California and New York. Dr. Amanda Flores set up a display documenting the medical careers that had begun with science curiosity nurtured in Eloise's classroom. David Henderson presented engineering projects inspired by problem-solving skills developed through multi-age peer teaching. Maria Santos Williams showcased literacy programs she had designed based on reading instruction methods she had experienced as a student. But the most powerful testimony came from James Patterson, Bertha's grandson, who had returned from his military service with stories of how critical thinking skills learned in a one-room schoolhouse had saved lives in combat situations. In Afghanistan, we faced problems that couldn't be solved by following standard procedures, he told the gathered crowd. We had to think creatively, adapt to unexpected situations, and work as a team despite different backgrounds and abilities. Those skills weren't taught in training manuals, they were learned right here, in this classroom, from a teacher who treated every student as an individual capable of growth. The event drew regional media attention, with reporters interviewing alumni about their educational experiences and current successes. For the first time since the crisis began, Eloise felt momentum shifting in their favor. But Monday brought a sobering reminder of the opposition they faced. Board Chairman Sterling arrived at the school unannounced, accompanied by a facilities inspector whose job was to document infrastructure deficiencies that could justify closure. The inspector spent 3 hours cataloging problems: outdated electrical systems, aging plumbing, windows that needed replacement, heating units past their recommended service life. Each notation felt like a nail being driven into the school's coffin. "Miss Carter," Sterling said as the inspection concluded, "I hope you understand we're not the villains here. We have legal obligations to ensure student safety and educational adequacy. This building requires substantial investment to meet current standards." "How substantial?" Eloise asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Conservative estimate, $200,000 for essential repairs and updates. The county simply doesn't have that kind of money for a school serving 14 students." That evening, Eloise sat on her porch, feeling the weight of impossibility settling over her like a heavy blanket. Frank stood beside her, his paint more faded than ever, one arm still hanging at an odd angle despite her attempts at repair. $200,000. She said to her wooden companion. "Where would a dying town find that kind of money? Maybe Sterling is right. Maybe we're fighting for something that's already gone." For the first time since the crisis began, Eloise allowed herself to consider defeat, not just the school's closure, but her own retreat from a battle that might be unwinnable. The Abilene position still waited, offering security and professional respect in exchange for abandoning her community and the children who needed her most. "What would you do, Frank? What would Thomas do?" The wooden cowboy maintained his silent vigil, but in the lamplight's glow, his painted expression seemed to shift slightly, not offering answers, but somehow suggesting that the most important questions were yet to be asked. Tomorrow would bring the final school board meeting, where decisions would be made that would reshape not just her life, but the lives of children whose futures hung in the balance. Whatever happened, Eloise knew she had fought with everything she had, but sometimes even the fiercest battles end in loss. Tuesday morning dawned grey and humid, matching Eloise's mood as she prepared for what might be her final day of teaching at Sparrows Bend Elementary. The school board meeting was scheduled for that evening, and despite all their efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to lose everything. She was organizing her desk when Jennifer Walsh, the county clerk, burst through the classroom door with wild eyes and a manila folder clutched against her chest. "Miss Carter, you have to see this. I couldn't sleep last night, so I went back to the courthouse to double-check something in Catherine Morrison's papers. Look what I found wedged behind a filing drawer. It must have fallen back there decades ago." Jennifer spread a folded document across Eloise's desk with trembling hands. The paper was brown with age, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, in ornate script, were the words "Property Deed and Educational Trust Agreement." "This is the original deed for the school land," Jennifer explained breathlessly. "But Miss Carter, it's not just a land donation, it's a legally binding trust with conditions that are still enforceable today." Eloise adjusted her reading glasses and began to decipher the formal legal language. What she found made her heart race with possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. The document, dated September 12, 1884, established that Catherine Morrison had donated 40 acres to Sparrow's Bend specifically for educational purposes. But the conditions were far more detailed than anyone had realized. The land could only be used for education so long as there are children in Sparrow's Bend and surrounding areas who would benefit from instruction. If the property ceased to serve educational purposes, ownership would revert to Catherine Morrison's descendants. More importantly, the trust included a provision that took Eloise's breath away. Any attempt to close the school would trigger a mandatory review period of 2 full years, during which the community would have the opportunity to demonstrate alternative funding sources and educational viability. Jennifer, are you certain this is legally binding? I called my cousin, who's a lawyer in Austin. She said trust documents from this era are often still enforceable, especially when they involve specific performance requirements. Miss Carter, this could change everything. But the most remarkable discovery came in the document's final paragraph, written in Catherine Morrison's own hand as an addendum. Should future generations face financial hardship in maintaining this educational mission, I have established a separate fund to be held in trust by the Cattlemen's Bank of Texas, to be used solely for the preservation and improvement of educational facilities in Sparrow's Bend. Eloise stared at the words, reading them twice to ensure she understood correctly. A separate fund? Jennifer, do you think? There's only one way to find out. The Cattlemen's Bank is now First National of Abilene. They've kept records going back to territorial days. Within an hour, they were driving toward Abilene in Jennifer's pickup truck, the precious document carefully protected in a plastic sleeve between them. Eloise's mind raced with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Could Catherine Morrison's 140-year-old foresight actually save their school? First National of Abilene occupied a modern building that showed no trace of its frontier origins, but the bank's archivist, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, proved to be a treasure trove of historical knowledge. The Morrison Educational Trust, she mused, consulting a computer database that stretched back decades. We maintain several old trust accounts, most of them dormant. Let me see. Yes, here it is. Established 1884, principal amount $500, which was substantial money in those days. Eloise's heart sank. $500 wouldn't make a dent in the school's financial needs. However, Mrs. Vance continued, this account has been earning compound interest for 141 years. Let me calculate the current balance. She typed rapidly, then stared at her screen in apparent disbelief. That can't be right. Let me recalculate. No, that's correct. Miss Carter, the Morrison Educational Trust currently holds $847,000. The words hit Eloise like a physical blow. $847,000 more than enough to renovate the school, modernize its facilities, and ensure its operation for years to come. But there are conditions, Mrs. Vance cautioned, scrolling through additional documents. The trust can only be activated by a direct descendant of Catherine Morrison or by unanimous petition from the Sparrow's Bend community. And the funds must be used specifically for educational improvements that preserve the school's original mission of individualized instruction. Jennifer was already reaching for her phone. Miss Carter, we need to find Catherine Morrison's descendants. If there are any still alive, they could activate this trust immediately. The search proved easier than expected. Catherine Morrison had never married, but her younger brother Thomas had remained in Texas and established a family. His great-great-granddaughter, Ruth Morrison Clark, lived just outside Austin and worked as an educational consultant for rural school districts. When Jennifer reached her by phone, Ruth's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. I've heard family stories about Aunt Catherine's school project my entire life, but I never knew about the trust fund. She was ahead of her time, believed that education should be tailored to individual children rather than forcing children to fit educational molds. If this money can preserve that vision, I'll drive to Sparrow's Bend today to sign whatever needs to be signed. The drive back to Sparrow's Bend passed in a blur of excited planning and cautious hope. Eloise couldn't quite believe their incredible fortune, but the legal documents seemed solid, and Ruth Morrison Clark had committed to attending that evening's school board meeting. "Miss Carter," Jennifer said as they pulled into town, "what if this is what Frank was really guarding? Not just your house, but the secret that could save everything." Eloise looked toward her house, where the wooden cowboy stood faithful watch on the porch. In the afternoon light, his weathered face seemed to wear a slight smile, as if he had known all along that patience and perseverance would eventually reveal hidden treasures. The school board meeting that evening drew the largest crowd in Sparrow's Bend's recent history. Word of the trust discovery had spread through the community like wildfire, bringing residents who hadn't attended a public meeting in years. Chairman Sterling called the meeting to order with obvious confusion about the sudden surge in community interest. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to vote on the closure of Sparrow's Bend Elementary, unless there are new developments that significantly alter the financial picture." "Mr. Sterling," Eloise interrupted, standing slowly. "There are indeed new developments." She presented the discovered documents with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades teaching children to organize their thoughts clearly. Ruth Morrison Clark spoke eloquently about her ancestors' educational vision and her commitment to honoring Catherine Morrison's legacy. The bank representative confirmed the trust fund's legitimacy and current balance, while Jennifer Walsh verified the legal documents' authenticity and enforceability. Board member after board member asked questions, clearly struggling to process information that completely transformed their understanding of the situation. The trust fund eliminated financial constraints. The deed's conditions created legal obligations they hadn't known existed. And the 2-year mandatory review period meant that closure couldn't be rushed, even if they wanted to proceed. "This is unprecedented," Sterling admitted finally. "We'll need time to have our legal counsel review these documents and their implications for the school district's responsibilities." "Mr. Sterling," Ruth Morrison Clark said firmly, "I'm prepared to activate the trust fund immediately, but only on condition that Sparrow's Bend Elementary continues operating with its current educational philosophy intact. My ancestor believed in individualized instruction and community-centered learning. If this money is used to transform the school into something unrecognizable, the trust reverts to dormancy." The meeting adjourned without a formal vote, but the tide had clearly turned. As residents filed out into the night air, their conversations buzzed with excitement and renewed hope. Eloise walked home slowly, still processing the day's miraculous developments. Frank waited on the porch, silent and steadfast as always, but somehow his presence felt different, not like a guardian against loss, but like a witness to impossible redemption. "Well, partner," she said softly, settling into her rocking chair beside him, "it seems Catherine Morrison was watching over this place long before you arrived. Maybe that's what guardians do. They help us discover the resources we didn't know we had." The wooden cowboy maintained his vigil, but in the starlight, his painted expression seemed peaceful, as if his duty was finally complete. The weeks following the trust fund discovery transformed Sparrow's Bend from a community bracing for loss into one buzzing with possibility. Yet beneath the excitement, Eloise sensed undercurrents of tension that made her uneasy. Not everyone celebrated their miraculous salvation. Wednesday morning brought the first sign of trouble. She arrived at school to find Frank lying on his side in her front yard, his wooden arm completely severed and his hat trampled into the dirt. Someone had vandalized her faithful guardian during the night, and the deliberate cruelty of the act struck her more deeply than she expected. "Who would do such a thing?" Tommy Martinez asked when he arrived for school and saw her kneeling beside the damaged figure. "I don't know, Tommy. Sometimes people hurt things they don't understand. She spent her lunch break attempting repairs, using wood glue and careful positioning to reattach Frank's arm. The break was clean, suggesting it had been kicked or struck with considerable force. As she worked, neighbors stopped to express their outrage and offer help. "Whoever did this has no respect for property or community," Doc Henley declared, examining the damage with a physician's attention to detail. This wasn't random vandalism, this was targeted. Sheriff Wade arrived that afternoon to take a report, though they all knew the chances of finding the culprit were slim. Still, his presence sent a message that the community wouldn't tolerate intimidation. "Miss Carter, I want you to know that most folks are behind you," he said as she finished giving her statement. "But change makes some people nervous, and money makes others greedy. You might want to be extra careful for a while." The warning proved prophetic. Thursday brought a visit from developers who had somehow learned about the trust fund and its potential impact on property values. Two men in expensive suits knocked on her door, introducing themselves as representatives of Lone Star Development Corporation. "Miss Carter, we understand you've come into some unexpected resources regarding the school situation," said the older man, whose smile never reached his eyes. "We wanted to discuss an opportunity that might benefit everyone involved." Eloise invited them in reluctantly, settling them in her living room while maintaining a polite but wary demeanor. "We're prepared to offer the community a substantial sum for the school property, enough to relocate educational services to a modern facility while allowing commercial development of the current site. Everyone wins. Children get better schools, the community gets economic development, and you receive recognition for your role in facilitating progress." The younger man opened a briefcase filled with glossy brochures showing shopping centers and housing developments. Sparrow's Bend could become a destination community with the right investment. Property values would increase, new businesses would bring jobs, and young families would move here for the small-town atmosphere. Eloise studied the materials with growing distaste. The developers envisioned transforming Sparrow's Bend into a suburb of Abilene, complete with chain stores and cookie-cutter housing that would erase every trace of the town's authentic character. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your interest, but the trust fund exists specifically to preserve educational services in our current location." Catherine Morrison was very clear about her intentions. "Miss Carter," the older man's tone hardened slightly, "trust documents from the 1880s aren't necessarily binding in today's legal environment. A good attorney could find ways to redirect those funds toward more practical purposes. We're offering partnership, but there are other approaches if cooperation isn't forthcoming." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air after they left. Eloise found herself checking her locks and drawing her curtains as evening fell, a precaution that would have seemed ridiculous just weeks earlier. Friday brought more concerning news. Ruth Morrison Clark called to report that she had received several phone calls from attorneys claiming to represent other Morrison descendants who disputed her authority to activate the trust fund. "It's strange," Ruth explained during their conversation. "I've researched our family genealogy extensively, and I'm not aware of any other living descendants with legitimate claims. But these lawyers are demanding documentation and threatening legal challenges. Could someone be manufacturing false claims to delay the trust activation? It's possible. I'm hiring my own attorney to research the matter, but legal proceedings could take months or even years to resolve. In the meantime, the money remains frozen." The news struck Eloise like a physical blow. Just when salvation seemed within reach, legal machinations threatened to snatch it away again. She spent the weekend researching property law and trust regulations, trying to understand the complexities that suddenly surrounded their simple desire to keep teaching children. Monday brought the most troubling development yet. Board Chairman Sterling requested a private meeting at his office in Abilene, and his demeanor suggested the conversation would be unpleasant. Sterling's office occupied the top floor of a modern building that overlooked the city's sprawling suburbs. Through his windows, Eloise could see housing developments stretching toward the horizon, the kind of growth that developers envisioned for Sparrow's Bend. "Miss Carter, I'll be direct. The situation has become complicated in ways that benefit no one. Legal challenges to the trust fund could drag on for years. The school building continues to deteriorate. State education officials are asking pointed questions about our compliance with current regulations." He leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with calculating eyes. "I'm prepared to offer you something unprecedented. The Abilene District will create a special position for you, Director of Individualized Learning Programs. You develop curricula that incorporate the teaching methods you've championed, but within a modern institutional framework. Substantial salary increase, full benefits, recognition as an educational innovator." The offer was everything Eloise might have dreamed of: professionally respect, resources, and the opportunity to influence education policy on a larger scale. But acceptance would mean abandoning Sparrow's Bend and the children who needed her most. "Mr. Sterling, what happens to the current students if I accept your offer?" "They'll be transferred to appropriate grade levels in our district schools. We'll provide transportation and ensure smooth transitions. They'll have access to programs and resources that simply aren't available in a one-room schoolhouse." "And what happens to Sparrow's Bend?" Sterling's expression hardened. "Miss Carter, communities evolve or they die. Clinging to outdated models serves no one's interests. The children deserve better, the taxpayers deserve efficiency, and frankly, you deserve recognition for your talents in an environment where they can make a real difference." The meeting ended without resolution, but Sterling's message was clear: accept modernization and personal advancement, or watch everything she cared about crumble under legal and bureaucratic pressure. That evening, Eloise sat on her porch beside Frank, who bore the scars of his recent attack but maintained his faithful vigil. She had carefully repaired his broken arm, though the wood glue lines remained visible as permanent reminders of the conflict surrounding their fight. "I'm scared, Frank," she admitted quietly. "Not of losing my job or starting over at 60. I'm scared of making the wrong choice for the children. What if Sterling is right? What if I'm holding them back by fighting for something that belongs in the past?" The wooden cowboy offered no answers, but his presence provided comfort in the growing darkness. Around them, Sparrow's Bend settled into evening quiet porch lights flickering on, televisions glowing through curtained windows, the peaceful sounds of a community going about its familiar routines. Tommy Martinez rode his bicycle past her house, calling out a cheerful, "Good night, Miss Carter," as he headed home. In that simple greeting, Eloise heard everything she was fighting to preserve: the sense of belonging, the personal connections, the knowledge that every child mattered as an individual rather than a statistic. Tuesday morning brought Ruth Morrison Clark to Sparrow's Bend for an emergency meeting. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of stress and frustration as she spread legal documents across Eloise's kitchen table. "The challenges to my authority are definitely manufactured," Ruth explained. "My attorney has traced them back to a law firm that specializes in property development litigation. Someone with deep pockets is trying to tie up the trust fund long enough to force the school's closure through other means. Can we fight it?" "We are fighting it, but legal battles take time, and time favors the developers. If the school closes while we're fighting over the money, they win by default." They spent the morning developing contingency plans, reaching out to former students for additional support, and documenting every aspect of Catherine Morrison's intentions for the trust fund. But underneath their strategic planning lay a growing sense of urgency. Forces beyond their control were gathering momentum that might prove unstoppable. "Miss Carter," Ruth said as she prepared to leave, "my ancestor believed that education was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Whatever happens in the next few weeks, we've honored her memory and given these children the best chance we could." That afternoon, as Eloise taught her lessons with renewed intensity, she found herself memorizing details she might never experience again. The way sunlight streamed through the tall windows, the sound of chalk on blackboard, the eager faces of children discovering new ideas. Every moment felt precious and fragile, like holding spring flowers that might be scattered by the next strong wind. The final confrontation was coming, and Eloise Carter, teacher, guardian, and reluctant warrior, prepared to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The final school board meeting convened on a Thursday evening that crackled with tension thick enough to cut. The community center overflowed with residents, media representatives, and unfamiliar faces who had arrived from surrounding counties to witness what many considered a defining moment for rural education in Texas. Eloise arrived early, wearing her best dress and her mother's pearl necklace armor for a battle that would determine not just her future, but the fate of 14 children and a community's identity. Frank waited at home on the porch, his repaired arm a testament to resilience in the face of deliberate harm. The atmosphere inside buzzed with nervous energy as people filed into every available seat. Former students occupied the front rows, their presence a living testament to the school's impact across generations. Doc Henley sat with Sheriff Wade, both men wearing expressions of grim determination. The Martinez family huddled together, Tommy and Maria wide-eyed at the crowd their small school had drawn. Board Chairman Sterling entered with his usual entourage, but tonight he was accompanied by additional figures, lawyers in expensive suits, a state education official with briefcases full of regulations, and representatives from the development company who had visited Eloise days earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling called the meeting to order with unusual formality, "tonight we will make final decisions regarding Sparrows Bend Elementary School. We have reviewed all available information, consulted with legal counsel, and considered the various proposals presented to this board." He shuffled through papers with deliberate precision, building tension that made the packed room hold its collective breath. The Morrison Trust Fund, while substantial, remains tied up in legal challenges that could continue for years. Meanwhile, we have immediate obligations to ensure these children receive appropriate education that meets state standards. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Sterling outlined the technical challenges, building code violations that would cost hundreds of thousands to correct, curriculum requirements that single-teacher instruction couldn't fully address, and transportation logistics that made consolidation seem inevitable. However, he continued, we have also received an unprecedented proposal that addresses these concerns while honoring community sentiment. The Lone Star Development Corporation has offered to purchase the current school property for $1.2 million, with proceeds dedicated to building a modern educational facility on land they will donate at the edge of town. Well, the announcement hit the room like a thunderclap. Excited whispers mixed with angry protests as residents processed this unexpected twist. Eloise felt her heart sink. The developers had found a way to get what they wanted while appearing to serve community interests. The new facility would feature modern classrooms, science laboratories, computer centers, and all amenities that current students lack. Transportation would be provided to students from surrounding areas, potentially increasing enrollment and program offerings. Dr. Amanda Flores stood immediately. "Mr. Sterling, what guarantees do we have that this new school would maintain the individualized instruction model that makes Sparrows Bend Elementary special? The Development Corporation has committed to hiring additional teachers, reducing class sizes, and implementing personalized learning programs based on modern educational technology." David Henderson rose from his seat near the back. "Technology can't replace the human connection that Miss Carter provides. Algorithms can't recognize when a child needs encouragement or when they're struggling with problems at home." Sterling's response carried subtle irritation. "Mr. Henderson, while we appreciate emotional testimony, we must base decisions on objective criteria. The proposed facility would serve children throughout this region, offering opportunities that simply aren't possible in our current situation. Ruth Morrison Clark requested permission to speak, approaching the podium with the quiet dignity that had characterized her ancestors' approach to education. Chairman Sterling, board members, fellow citizens, my great-great-aunt Catherine Morrison established her trust fund specifically to preserve individualized education in this community. She believed that children learn best when they are known, valued, and nurtured as individuals rather than processed as identical units. Her voice carried growing strength as she continued. The development proposal, while generous in its financial terms, fundamentally contradicts Catherine's vision. She wanted education that adapted to children, not children forced to adapt to institutional systems. Ms. Morrison Clark, Sterling interrupted, with respect to your ancestors' intentions, educational theory has evolved significantly since 1884. Modern pedagogy emphasizes measurable outcomes, standardized curricula, and technological integration that simply cannot be provided in a single teacher environment. The room erupted in competing voices, parents arguing about what was best for their children, former students defending their educational experiences, community members debating the value of tradition versus progress. Through the chaos, Eloise sat silently, watching democracy struggle with one of its most fundamental challenges, balancing individual needs against institutional efficiency. When Sterling finally restored order, he announced that the board would hear final testimony before conducting a formal vote. The next hour would determine whether Sparrows Bend Elementary School would close forever, transform beyond recognition, or somehow find a way to survive as the unique educational environment it had always been. Eloise closed her eyes and thought of Frank, standing faithful watch on her porch, ready to face whatever darkness the night might bring. When Sterling called for final testimony, Eloise rose slowly from her seat, her 60 years feeling both heavy and light simultaneously. The packed room fell silent as she approached the podium, every eye focused on the woman whose quiet dedication had sparked this community-wide battle. Chairman Sterling, board members, neighbors, and friends, she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. 37 years ago, I walked into Sparrows Bend Elementary as a young teacher with grand dreams about changing the world. Tonight, I stand before you not as someone defending the past, but as someone who has witnessed education's true purpose. She paused, looking out at faces she had known for decades, students she had taught, parents she had counseled, community members who had become family. Tommy Martinez, would you stand up, please? The 10-year-old rose from his seat beside his parents, his brown eyes serious but unafraid. Tommy, tell everyone how you learn best. The boy's voice carried clearly through the silent room. I learn better when Miss Carter explains things different ways, until I understand. When I didn't get fractions, she used pieces of pie. When multiplication was hard, she let me walk around while I practiced. She knows I think better when I move. Thank you, Tommy. Eloise's voice carried gentle warmth. Sarah Henderson, would you share your experience? Sarah stood with the poise of someone twice her 16 years. Miss Carter doesn't just teach subjects, she teaches us to think. When I read ahead in our books, she finds harder books for me. When I struggle with something, she helps me figure out why, instead of just giving me the answer. She knows each of us as individuals. Testimony followed from student after student, each sharing personal stories of being seen, understood, and nurtured as unique individuals. Their words painted a picture of education that transcended test scores and curriculum standards, learning that touched hearts and transformed lives. Dr. Amanda Flores approached the podium with the authority of someone who had spent decades treating children. I've worked with thousands of young patients from schools across Texas. The children from Sparrows Bend consistently demonstrate higher levels of confidence, curiosity, and resilience than their peers. They're not just academically prepared, they're emotionally and socially equipped for life's challenges. But the most powerful moment came when Maria Santos Williams presented her research findings. Charts and graphs displayed on borrowed equipment showed that Sparrows Bend graduates consistently outperformed state averages in college completion, career satisfaction, and community involvement. "The data is clear," Maria announced. "Whatever we're doing in that little schoolhouse, it works. These children don't just succeed academically, they become leaders, innovators, and compassionate human beings who make their communities better." Sterling listened with growing impatience, finally interrupting. "These testimonials are touching, but they don't address fundamental issues. State regulations require specific teacher-to-student ratios, standardized curricula, and facility standards that this school cannot meet. Sentiment cannot override legal obligations." That's when Miguel Martinez stood, hat in his weathered hands, and approached the microphone with the dignity of someone who had worked hard his entire life. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not educated like these other folks. I work cattle, fix fences, and do what I can to provide for my family. But I know this: my children matter. Not as numbers on your reports, but as human beings with dreams and fears and gifts that need nurturing." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "You want to put Tommy and Maria on a bus for 2 hours every day, drop them in classrooms with 30 other kids, and hope some overworked teacher notices when they're struggling. Miss Carter knows my son is scared of thunderstorms, but loves math problems. She knows my daughter reads above her grade level, but needs extra help with handwriting. That's not sentiment, Mr. Sterling, that's education." The room erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. When order was finally restored, Sterling consulted with the other board members in whispered conferences that stretched the tension to breaking point. Ruth Morrison Clark rose once more, holding a document that had arrived by courier just hours earlier. "Chairman Sterling, I have an update regarding the Morrison Trust Fund. My attorney has successfully challenged the fraudulent claims against my authority. As of this afternoon, I am legally empowered to activate the trust immediately." She approached the podium with quiet determination. "I hereby commit 847,000 from the Morrison Educational Trust to renovate and modernize Sparrows Bend Elementary School on the condition that it continue operating as a community-centered, individualized learning environment that honors my ancestors' vision." The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Sterling's face darkened as his carefully orchestrated plans crumbled before his eyes. "Furthermore," Ruth continued, "the original deed restrictions have been confirmed by multiple legal authorities. This land can only be used for educational purposes in perpetuity. Any attempt to sell or redevelop the property would be legally invalid." The developers, who had been sitting confidently in the back rows, suddenly looked like men who had lost a very expensive gamble. Their carefully constructed scheme had been dismantled by a woman honoring her ancestors' 140-year-old promise to future generations. Sterling called for a brief recess, but everyone in the room knew the battle was over. The school would survive, the community would remain intact, and 14 children would continue learning in an environment where they were valued as individuals rather than statistics. Justice, it seemed, sometimes arrived in the most unexpected packages. 6 months later, Eloise stood in the doorway of her transformed classroom, marveling at changes that preserved the soul of Sparrows Bend Elementary while embracing the possibilities of the future. New windows filled the space with natural light. Modern heating and cooling systems ensured year-round comfort, and updated electrical systems, powered computers, and interactive whiteboards that enhanced rather than replaced traditional teaching methods. The wooden floors had been refinished to their original luster, and fresh paint brightened walls that now displayed both historical photographs and student artwork spanning generations. Catherine Morrison's portrait hung near the main entrance, a reminder of the visionary woman whose foresight had saved not just a building, but an approach to education that the world desperately needed. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Tommy Martinez called out as he bounded through the front door, his backpack bulging with books and projects. At 10, he had grown several inches and gained the confidence that came from knowing he was valued and understood. His reading had improved dramatically, though he still preferred mathematics and the hands-on science experiments that were now possible with the classroom's new equipment. "Good morning, Tommy. Are you ready for our astronomy unit?" "Yes. Maria and I stayed up last night looking at stars with the telescope you borrowed from the high school. We saw Saturn's rings." The classroom gradually filled with 14 students whose lives had been forever changed by their community's refusal to accept defeat. Sarah Henderson, now 17, had been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships, her exceptional academic achievements balanced by the leadership skills she had developed helping younger students. The Martinez children had stayed in Sparrow's Bend, their father Miguel now working as the school's part-time maintenance coordinator, a position created with trust fund money to ensure the building remained in perfect condition. At 9 o'clock, Eloise rang the original 1885 school bell that had been restored and rehung in its tower. The familiar chime called children to learning, just as it had for nearly 140 years. A sound that connected past and present in an unbroken chain of educational dedication. "Today, we're beginning our unit on local history," Eloise announced as her students settled into their seats. "We'll be researching the families who founded Sparrow's Bend, including the remarkable woman who made our school possible." The morning passed with the familiar rhythm of multi-age instruction that had been refined over decades of practice. Older students mentored younger ones, advanced learners explored independent projects, and every child received the individual attention that made learning a joy rather than a chore. During lunch, eaten at their desks, while rain drummed against the new windows, Eloise reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The legal battles had been resolved. The developers had moved on to other projects, and Board Chairman Sterling had quietly resigned, replaced by community members who understood that education's value couldn't be measured solely in spreadsheets. The afternoon brought visitors, former students who made regular pilgrimages to their educational home, parents who marveled at their children's growth, and educators from other districts who came to observe the teaching methods that had produced such remarkable results. Dr. Amanda Flores arrived just before dismissal, her white coat traded for casual clothes that made her look more like the shy girl she had once been than the accomplished physician she had become. "Miss Carter, I wanted to update you on the scholarship fund we've established. Alumni donations have reached 50, enough to support several students pursuing higher education each year." "That's wonderful, Amanda. Catherine Morrison would be proud to know her legacy continues growing." As the school day ended and her students departed for afternoon activities that now included organized sports and music lessons funded by the trust, Eloise began her familiar routine of preparing for the next day. But tonight felt different, celebratory, rather than merely satisfying. The evening walk home took her past, the new bronze plaque mounted beside the school's front entrance. Carter Community School, honoring excellence in individualized education since 1885. The name had been the school board's idea, a gesture of recognition that had moved Eloise to tears when they unveiled it. Frank waited on her porch as always, but his appearance had been transformed along with everything else. Doc Henley's nephew, an artist who had learned woodworking as a hobby, had carefully restored the wooden cowboy to his original glory. Fresh paint brought out details that had been obscured by decades of weather, and a new hat, carved from the same wood as the original, sat at the perfect angle to suggest both vigilance and gentle humor. "Well, partner," Eloise said, settling into her rocking chair beside him, "we did it. Not just saved the school, but made it better while keeping what made it special." She opened her evening mail and found another letter from a former student, this one from Jennifer Walsh, who had been promoted to head county clerk in recognition of her historical research skills. Dear Miss Carter, the letter read, I wanted you to know that our story has inspired other communities facing similar challenges. School districts across Texas are requesting information about the Sparrows Bend model of education. You haven't just saved our school, you've started a movement. As twilight settled over the town, Eloise reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from their struggle. The most important battles aren't always the ones that make headlines, but the quiet fights to preserve what matters most, the dignity of individuals, the strength of communities, and the belief that every child deserves to be seen, known, and nurtured. The wooden cowboy stood sentinel beside her, no longer just a guardian against loneliness, but a symbol of the unexpected allies who appear when we need them most. Sometimes, salvation comes in packages we don't recognize, a $5 carnival figure, a forgotten trust document, or the courage to fight for what we believe in, even when the odds seem impossible. Thank you, Frank, she whispered to her wooden companion, for protecting not just my home, but helping me find the strength to protect what mattered most. Stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Catherine Morrison's dreams, Thomas Carter's dedication, and now Eloise's triumph. In the distance, the school bell tower stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, ready to call another generation of children to learning in a place where education remained what it was always meant to be, a celebration of human potential and the endless possibilities that bloom when we dare to believe in each other. The story of Sparrows Bend Elementary would continue, carried forward by teachers and students not yet born, but rooted in the timeless truth that learning matters most when it touches the heart as well as the mind.